In high school, I always enjoyed multiple choice because it meant that I had a 25% chance of getting the question right. So here you go. What best describes, or best, let's do this, should describe Mission Bible Church? Okay. A, should we be viewing or feeling or sensing that we are a business? Should we be viewing or sensing or feeling, number 2, or letter B, that we are a club or maybe a team? Number 3, or letter C, should we be sensing or feeling or experiencing that we are a government or a governing body of some kind? Or letter D, should we be sensing, experiencing, and feeling that we are in fact a family? What's the right answer? A, B, C, or D? It's not really a trick question. More and more, what should be happening at Mission Bible when you come in, and I know that the church has grown a lot, and so it can be hard, but more and more, what should be happening is you should be sensing that the church is actually a family. I actually was talking with a guy recently, and was telling him that it feels like you're the brother that I never had. And the principle behind that is something that we could call, you'll see them, and the way that you see them is the way that you'll treat them. You'll treat people the way that you, in fact, see people. In the world, obviously, we see people typically as transactional. The world system is, by and large, a transactional system, right? You go to your coworkers at work, and although many people won't admit it, often you view your coworkers as kind of a rival in a sense. Or maybe a friend. In the world system, a friend is really just a common cause, somebody who likes to do the same things that you do or go to the same places that you go, and when those things fall apart, you don't typically carry on the friendship too much longer. Or even though we hate to admit it, sometimes even a spouse in the world system can be a little bit of a quid pro quo. What you do for me is what I'll do for you, and a back and forth begins. But that's not the way it's supposed to work in the church. In the church, we're supposed to view ourselves as family members. And so literally right now, if you're a member of the church, you're supposed to be viewing yourself, looking around at the older men as kind of like fathers. And I'm to be viewing you, the older women out there, as kind of like my mothers. And then in some respects, the men that are my age, I view as brothers. And then the sisters that are in here, or the ladies in here, I would view as maybe as sisters in the faith. That's what the heart of the church is supposed to become. And that's what I want to show you this morning. What we're going to call mark number 6 of a healthy church is the key to truly showing compassion and care to our church family. So if you have your copy of God's Word, grab it with me again, and let's open it to 1 Timothy chapter 5. And let's look at mark number 6 of a healthy church, this idea of caring for each other as family. And, the kind of compassion that the Lord expects, and even one of the strongest verses in the entire Bible. In fact, there is one verse in here it is a gut punch. I mean, it is straight to the soul. It is a no-holds-barred verse, and it's gonna cause a few of us in the room today, as it has me again this week, to pause and to think and to reflect very deeply on how we're doing as a Christian. And so if you have your Bibles there with you, go ahead and look with me at 1 Timothy 5, and let's glance at verses 1 and 2 to get a framework as Paul continues helping us understand what a healthy church is. He says, "Do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father. To the younger men as brothers, and the older women as mothers, and the younger women as sisters, in all purity." So there's your principle. You're going to treat them how you see them, and the way that you need to see them is as family. So the older men, you need to actually show respect to. And even if you disagree with them, you appeal to them. You don't come and put your finger in their chest. You approach them like you would a father. And with the older ladies in the church, you're to approach them with a sense of reverence and a sense of tenderness when you talk to them and when you're around them. And then, of course, the brothers, if anyone here had a brother, you know how that is. It's a little more straightforward. It's a little more straight shooting, right? You guys probably did some WWE tumbling on the couch, but You can talk to them in a certain way. But even the sisters, he says, remember talking to Timothy as a young pastor in the faith, he says, when you talk to a younger woman, you view her as a sister, meaning you show concern for her, but you're always doing it with sexual purity and with the best of intentions. So right away, we begin to see the big picture for where Paul is going to be going here in the next couple of chapters. And really, we need to remember that Paul never, ever uses an analogy haphazardly. Paul never just throws an analogy out, right? Although that there is governance in a church, it is not a government, right? Although there is operations in a church, it is not primarily a business. The church is, he says, a family. You've got one common Father, and in one respect, Jesus Christ goes before you as your eldest brother, and one day, very soon, you're going to spend forever together in a common home. So you need to view the church, even on earth, as your family. And what he's going to do is he's going to take that principle to set up what we call the widow issue. Because in the first century, the first issue in the local church was the issue of widows. Because the Greco-Roman world did not care very well for women at all, especially women who couldn't give anything back in their mind, in their view, to the men. So even the young boys, when they were born, would be kept, but the young females, a lot of times, would be discarded. There's no welfare. There's no public assistance. There's no charities. There's no benevolence. And so, once a woman lost her husband, she would either end up often in starvation or prostitution. A lot of times we forget that it was Christianity that gave the giant leap forward into what we would call equality to men and women, and care for women, and welfare for women, and public assistance for women, and even voting rights for women. We often forget that what we experience and take for granted right now in our country, and which is even designated in the Declaration of Independence, all began from the Apostle Paul and his Hebrew roots, when he begins writing these letters to Asia Minor and the Roman Empire, saying that men and women are all what? Created in the image of God, the Imago Dei. And they deserve respect and justice and care and love in the best sense of those terms, biblically speaking. So it's with that in mind that he moves on to what we call the widow issue. And we're going to learn a lot here, not about just widows today, but we're going to learn a lot about women in general in the church. And we're going to learn a lot about all of us and how we care for these women, and specifically these widows. And so number one, if you have your pen out, go ahead and get working with me here in verse 3. Let's start with the support of widows, then we'll move to the family of widows, and then the qualification of widows. And so number one, let's look at the support of widows. It's right there in verse 3. Here's the big principle. Honor widows, he says, who are widows indeed. Now, the Greek there just seems, the widow would be, a good word for it, but it really just means one that's robbed or one that's left alone. Picture a lady, she gets saved, she comes into church membership, her husband dies, she's got nobody, and then the idea here is the church needs to honor her, which can mean care for or respect her or even provide for her. And notice that he says she's alone indeed, meaning she doesn't have any recourse. She doesn't have any other resources, right? She's truly alone. I mean, oftentimes, especially nowadays, you get insurance, you get state assistance, you get welfare. And so a lady who's lost a husband isn't always really unable to care for herself. I always tell Bree that, by the way. I always say, honey, listen, when I die, when this lughead dies because of insurance, you're going to have a much better life. Now, she doesn't like that. She's like, no, don't say that. I'm like, it's true. Maybe not emotionally, but physically, you'll be better off, right? Some of you ladies are like, take him, right? Just joking. But very important to understand that this is the only passage in the Bible that ever mentions what we call the list. In some way in the first century, there was an eligibility roster where there was a group of women whose husbands had died, and we're going to talk all about this list this morning. And the idea here is that the church would then step in if they were on the list and would begin taking care of them. And really the idea probably is what we call an honorarium, where this woman would basically give the remainder of her life to acts of service in the church, and then the church would provide a stipend so that she would have food on the table and not starve. And we get a lot of that from the early church fathers, whether it's Ignatius or Polycarp or Tertullian. You see again and again and again these elderly ladies who are provided for by the church, who are caring for orphans and for other widows and for helping young women train their children and all of these wonderful things that they would do. So that's the picture here as he says, support and honor the widows. And we still have lists like that today. That, by the way, is what you want to be involved in church membership. You want to be a covenant member of a church and not just float around the evangelical ethersphere, because then there's no church that knows who you are. And if something happens in your life, there's no church that can care for you. That's why it's so important to be a part of a local church, which leads us to number 2. Look at verse 4. Family of widows. The family of the widows. So now he begins to put kind of the criteria in place for who gets cared for in the church and financially, and then who doesn't. He says in verse 4, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family. And so he's laying out the framework. If a lady has lost her husband and she has children or grandchildren, their job first and foremost is to care for mama, not the church, and to make some return to their parents. That's their job. For this is acceptable in the sight of God. And so you get the general criteria there. If she's got kids or grandkids, if you have a mother who loses your father, her husband, then it's your responsibility and my responsibility to care for our mother. There's 2 reasons he gives there. First is practical piety. It's the most godly thing that they can do. And second, because it pays back the debt. You know, she birthed you. She fed you. She nurtured you. She taught you. So the least you can do is care for her between here and glory. And a great example in the Old Testament, Genesis 45, is Joseph. You know, Joseph becomes the king or the co-heir, the second in command of Egypt. And the very first thing he does once he gets his brothers squared away is he sends them back in a caravan with guards and money. And he says, bring dad and bring mom. And actually says, hurry. I have been made Lord of Egypt. So come now quickly because I want to care for my parents. And by the way, Joseph is an interesting story because it's really hard to ever find him doing something wrong. One of the only men in the entire Bible who every time you read, you go, wow, he seems to always be doing what is right. A great young man to study. And then in verse 5, look at the turn. Now, a little bit more criteria. She who is a widow indeed, and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. So he's going to continue laying out this woman who's going to be cared for and who isn't. So he says she has literally, since the time her husband died, fixed her hope on God and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. Think of someone like Anna in Luke chapter 2, who literally when her husband dies, she goes to the temple and she's serving literally for the rest of her life. That's the picture of her. Verse 6, but, very important to read closely, she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. Timothy, I want you to prescribe these things as well so that they may be above reproach. How interesting is that? That he adds in how the widow responds, the woman responds, when her hubby dies. And he says there's 2 ways that she's going to respond. One, she's going to throw herself into the church. She's going to throw herself on Christ. And she's going to trust him with caring for her. Or her grief is going to throw her back into what? Her old life, into worldly pleasures, potentially in the first century, into prostitution and everything that came with it. And he says if she does that, she's already dead. She's already going back to her old life, spiritually speaking. And you don't need to care for her. She's made her choice. She's made her choice. Isn't that interesting that there's a choice that a woman makes in grief, and men too? That they're either going to step deeper and closer into the person of Christ in the church, or they're going to step back into the nightlife and the traveling and the martinis and the parties to try to deal with the void that's inside their soul. So he says, number 1, look at her family and make sure there's no one to care for her. Number 2, look at her life and how she responded to grief. And then look at verse 8. We call this an antecedent. He's building off of the woman's desire to go back into sin and back into her old life. And then he says in verse 8, but if anyone, referring now to the families of this particular woman, But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And this is one of those verses that you just have to circle in your Bible, and you have to come back to again and again, because what he's doing is the but there links the antecedent, meaning the woman who's back in her pleasures and in her worldly life, with the family who's not providing for her. And he says, and you, if you don't care for her, you've become complicit in her sin. You're the one who's partly responsible for what she's chosen. And if you don't provide for your own, not only are you disparaging the name of Christ, you're just as bad as a pagan, he says. And a part of her sinful spiral. Now, this is where we have to pause, friends, and we all need to hear this. We all have to hear this. Ladies, grief does not give you license to sin. And men too. Just because you're hurting and you're lonely, just because you're going through a hard time and even wondering how you're going to pay the bills, he says that does not give you the free-for-all to go back into your old life. You need to press deeper into the person of Christ. And then he looks at the entire family. And he says, not providing for your hurting mother is basically the single worst sin that you can ever do on planet Earth. He says, in action, you've denied the faith. In action, you've ignored the very royal command of Christ, who said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, love others as yourself. You've taken the very heart of the gospel and you have stomped on it. If your own mother has lost your father and is hurting and you don't step in to help her, he says that is the most un-Christian thing that you can ever do, which is why he then uses the pagan lifestyle as his contrast, because get this, even the Greco-Roman guys, the Greco-Roman world, cared for their mom and their dad. In fact, you would get booted from the Senate in politics if you didn't care for your mom and dad. Demosthenes said that you have raised your fists against the gods if you do not care for your family line. And Paul says, listen, it is unconscionable for an individual who calls himself a Christian to let their mother go into her old life hurting and alone. You know what's interesting is right there, a lot of us begin to justify things in our mind. We go, but you don't know my mom. Or you don't know my mother-in-law. There's no qualifier here. And then he gives, after support in the family, the qualifications for the widows who are going to be cared for by the church. So assuming that their kids and grandkids aren't going to be able to care for them or aren't caring for them, and then assuming that she's responding well when her husband dies, and then assuming that the church is her only option, he then in verse 9 goes on to qualifications. Look at this, qualifications of widows. Who gets on the list? Verse 9, let a widow be put on the list only, and he just lays it out, if she is no less than 60 years old. So she's got to truly be older, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and the rest are subordinate clauses. If she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted in those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. So since this list is meant to be, these gals, a permanent fixture in the church, and basically they're finishing the race in their fourth quarter, serving the church, their standards are super high. I mean, the bar for a godly woman, it's high. In fact, if you take these standards and you line them up next to the elders and the deacons, they're very similar. And it makes sense, right? If she's going to spend 10 years serving the church basically full-time with a stipend attached, she needs to be a true woman of God. And then he actually lays them all out there. Just scroll through them. Must be 60. In the Mishnah, that was the age of being a senior citizen, right? A true senior. Life expectancy wasn't too much longer after that back then. The libido had faded, right? She's truly in the fourth quarter of her life. She's a one-man woman, it says, just like an elder or deacon. The Christian testimony is that she wasn't a lady of the night. She's not sleeping around. She was a woman who truly loved her husband and was faithful to him. She has a reputation, look at this, for good works. meaning that the inworking of her salvation had an outworking of service to the point that, like James says, you could see her faith by her works. She had fruits of righteousness. And so when everyone stands back, they look at her and they go, oh my goodness, this is a woman of God. And that's why he adds all the subordinate clauses. She's brought up kids, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she's been humble in her serving, if she's been involved in the lifeblood of the church, right? And the picture of her, obviously, in the New Testament, back in Acts chapter 9, everyone remembers, is a gal named Tabitha. Do you remember Tabitha's translated name? Dorcas. That's tough, but that's her name. But you remember Dorcas? Let's call her Tabitha, because I can't do that with a straight face. But you remember Tabitha? I mean, she was well known for what? She dies, the apostles get to her house, and everyone is weeping. You remember that? They're crying in her room, they're leaking outside her house, and they're all crying, and they're saying, they're holding the fabrics that she made. She loved us, she loved us. In Acts chapter 9, verse 36, it says, she was always abounding in good works and care for widows. That's the picture here. The picture of a woman who year after year after year was serving the church to the point that when her husband dies, get this, everybody cries and says, we have to take care of her because to lose her from this church would be to lose the very heart of who we are. Which means, are you ready, ladies? This is important. You want to write this down. The point here is that the list is comprised, you ready, of 10, 20, or 30 years of faithfulness. Literally, he says, the women that get on the list are women who have shown decades worth of faithful service to the Lord. The way that she has loved her husband, the way that she has raised her kids, the way that she has been devoted to the local church, forces the church to say, what else could we do except make sure that this woman can stay a part of the local church? We need her as part of the local church. And that right there, ladies, I want to share this as honestly and as transparently and kindly as I possibly can. That is why these verses right here, you have to put to memory. This is not simply a passage about how to care for widows. This is setting the bar for what every young Christian woman in the church should be striving to be. And it is exactly antithetical and opposite what the world tells you to be. Did you catch that? The world says what? You need to leave your house, you need to go build your career, and you need to chase your dreams. That's what the world tells you. And meanwhile, the voice of the living God just said, hey, listen, I want you in the house, I want you loving your husband as his helpmate, I want you caring for the children, and I want you devoted to the local church. And those are the women that after 10, 20, 30 years, the rest of the church says, yes, what else would we do but care for them? You say, well, I need more proof. That's just not enough for me to believe. Well, look at verse 11. That's why he adds in support, family, qualification, and then the refusal of widows. Who's not going to make the list? Who's not ready yet for the list? Right there in verse 11. But refuse to put who? Younger widows on the list. Why? Because when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, not meaning they don't like Christ, just means that they make these pledges to him and then they kind of renege on them. They want to marry. And you can already picture, right? Young lady, she's in grief, she's in sorrow. So her husband is gone. She goes to the church. She says, I'm all in. I just want to serve Jesus. I could care less about men. And then all of a sudden, that works until tall, dark, and handsome walks by. That's the point he's making. So refuse to put the younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires disregarding Christ, they want to marry, thus incurring condemnation, not judgment from God, but just people looking at them going, hey, didn't you make a promise that now you're not keeping? Because they've set aside their previous pledge. And at the same time, they also learn to be idle as they go about from house to house, not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach, for some have already turned aside to follow who? Satan. Literally, Paul is equating this lifestyle of go out, do what you want, chase your dreams, have a good time, watch a soap opera, travel, with a lifestyle that would honor the world system led by Satan. People say the Bible's not clear about the role of a woman. So the criteria for the older women is clear, and the plan for the younger women is clear. And I hope you understand what he's saying. Because of her, now this is not bad, this is not sinful, friends. Because of her natural God-given desire for marriage and sex and children, her inclination, he says, go remarry. Go remarry. And right here you can see already where the Roman Catholic Church got it wrong. They get it wrong in a lot of ways, but here you can see a big one, right? Nuns and convents. It's like they took the first 10 verses and said, hey, let's take all our gals and put them in a convent, and then they forgot the rest of it. Sound of Music. Great musical, bad theology. And he explains here the reasons why remarriage is so important. Did you catch it? Look, number one, they're going to renege on the pledge. She's going to be in grief. She's going to make the vow, and the church is going to put her to work, put her on a stipend, and then, like I said, cute surfer guy comes walking by. And imagine, let's not be unkind. Imagine a 33-year-old gal, 32. She loses her husband. She's in grief, and she's thinking, I just want to serve Jesus. She can't even picture herself being back on the market. She can't even picture herself being with another man. That makes sense, doesn't it? Most of you ladies who are married to a husband are going, yeah, totally makes sense. I can't fathom that. But then a few months go by or a few years go by, and all of a sudden she's sitting there and she sees somebody, and she's been serving the Lord and made it public declaration. That's all she was going to do with the rest of her life. But then she sees him, and he looks at her, and she looks at him, and his eyes are blue, and there's that moment, la la la, la la la. And what happens in her heart is she begins to wrestle, right? She's like, no way, I made this pledge, but oh my goodness, and back and forth. And then she starts to feel unfulfilled because she's still young enough to have children, and then she begins to wonder, and then what happens is she breaks the pledge, she starts feeling guilty, she begins to question her salvation, and Paul says, I don't want that for the younger women. But he also says they have too much energy still. They're idle, house to house, bouncing around, right? All the visits which were for ministry time suddenly become social time. And where does that go? He says it becomes destructive, gossip, talking of things not proper, right? Let's not pick on the gals. Let's not pick on gals. Let's just talk about things that are scientifically proven. Women tend to say more words than men. That's science. That's not me. Be mad at science. Don't be mad at me. Trust the science. Listen, but let's also talk philosophically. Is it not true, just generally speaking, right, that men will talk more about ideas and ladies tend to like to talk more about feelings? Is it not also true, generally speaking, that men like to talk more about program and then ladies tend to like to talk more about people-oriented issues, right? So what happens is if you have a bunch of young women and they're going around talking about feelings and people all the time, you can see how very quickly that could become catastrophic for the church. Which is why he says, don't give that opening yet. Don't give that opening for the young women to the enemy. If boredom is Satan's playground, listen closely, if boredom is Satan's playground, a purposeless existence is his Disneyland. Showing up every day with money in the bank and nothing to do is guaranteed to cause problems and to open up a door for the enemy to hurt people. And I want to add a note there, which is not even inferred, it's implied, which is that it takes a very, very, very seriously minded, sober-minded woman to really be able to minister to younger women. Which is why Titus 2 says you want the older women to be ministering to the younger women. You know, Bree has a wonderful mentor who meets with her often. She's 70 years old. She is a widow. She's a former pastor's wife. But listen, I'm going to be honest. This gal, this lady is a straight shooter. There is no messing around. There's not a phone call that goes by where Bree doesn't come back in, with her head down like, man, I just got my mail read to me. I got hit hard. Now, why is that? Because by that age, if the woman has been on her journey that long and in the Word that long, she's not people-pleasing. She doesn't fear anybody. She's given you the truth of God's Word. Now, it's not to say young women can't minister to other young women through God's Word. They can, but it's a lot more difficult, right? Because number one, they don't have the experience behind it, but number two is often they will fear the person more than they want to share the truth, and they will say things in a way that gets friendship instead of the truth in front of them. Which is why it's so important to make sure, ladies, that you have an older woman who's been there before counseling you, because you cannot be a great discipler until you've first been a great disciple. You cannot be a great leader until you've first been a follower. You must be trained by somebody else further along in the faith. That's what discipleship is. It's truth passing down from generation to generation to generation. So he literally says there's a support for the widow. But the family first is the one who cares for the widow. And any support that does happen has to be qualified to make sure that the widow is lived appropriately, and then the younger widows are the ones who need to wait and continue to grow, and they need to build their home until the time is right. And they're ready and in need. So we're not going to have time. There's no way we're going to have time to get through the rest of these verses on the men and eldership, and so we'll come back to those. But let me ask you, I was thinking about this week. Is there a general application for all of us in here who aren't dealing with the widow issue necessarily? And I'm going to say, yeah, there is. You ready? Here's an application. Call your mom. That's just for starters. Let's just start there. This is obviously talking about physical care. But the implication of verse 8 is that if we're not loving our mother and caring for our mother, especially if your father's gone and tanked and he's out of here, you got to really dig deep and question who you are in the Lord. But I think the biggest general application here for all of us is to remember that we're family. I mean, right now, you're sitting in a room, you got fathers, you got mothers, you got sisters, you got brothers, and you literally are sitting next to your family. In fact, get this, a spiritual family is often and is much more close than your biological and your blood-born family will be. And if you don't agree with me on that, wait till Thanksgiving. When you're sitting around and you're like, man, I want to be back at church right now, right? This hit me big time. This last week, I had two young ones walk into my office. And, they're 10, 8. And they said, hey, can we ask you a question? And I got it from the desk, and I invited them in, and I gave them a lollipop, and they said, can we ask you a question? I said, what is it? They said, well, you know that our daddy left, and their daddy has abandoned them. They said, we're going in for a music class, and our music teacher, it's School of Rock. You ever heard of that? Remember, School of Rock. They said, our School of Rock teacher, he's having us sing a song that doesn't honor Jesus. In fact, it makes fun of Jesus. And they said, our consciences won't let us do it, and we don't know how to tell him. And as I began to sit there with them and talk with them about how to go in and talk about their conscience and talk about what it would mean to step out of the song and let the teacher understand why and their biblical convictions. And I'm watching these little faces, and the little guy's like, yes, got it, okay, very good. And I realized in that moment, he doesn't have a dad. So if you're not his dad, and I'm not his dad, and that's the beauty of the church. He does. He's got 1,000 of them. A couple days later, it was Friday, I got over to visit Aaron and Chrissy Smith. And they had little baby Eleanor Noel. And I don't know how many of you remember, it was 2 years ago now that when, during the birth of Noah, their firstborn, he died in childbirth. And it was the most amazing thing to have gone through the heartache and sorrow of visiting that Kaiser Permanente at 11 p.m. on a Sunday night, and to be holding the little cold frame of Noah, who was not alive, and then 2 years later to be holding little Eleanor Noel, who was, with her big long piano fingers, and she could probably carry a pitch or tune already, knowing who she came from. And I actually looked up at Bree, and I said, I think I actually love her as much right now as I did when I was holding my own children. I don't know if that's allowed to be said. I don't know if that's okay. And Bree said, well, that's because when you had your own children, when you were holding our kids, you were just afraid to not kill them. You remember when they first let you come out of the hospital and you're putting that little baby in that little carrier and you're just thinking, I hope I did it right. And then you pick that little baby up for the first time and you're just trying to make sure the head doesn't pop off and die. You remember that? So the last thing on my mind was, oh Lord, I'm going to pray for this little one, but it was with little Eleanor, and I'm thinking, oh, I just love you so much, and you're so beautiful, and I'm just so thankful, and you don't even know the treasure and the story of your life, and how God, in that night when we were weeping and asking questions of why he took Noah, is now answering them with you, and it was beautiful. And it hit me in that moment, like, that's what it means to be a spiritual grandfather. There's another couple that's been in ministry. They're part of our church. They've been in ministry, get this, for 50 years. And they are finishing the race well. But they've now hit a point where they don't have the ability because of cancer and because of some things going on in the brain to be able to come to church the way that they used to. Can you imagine 50 years of serving the Lord, and then all of a sudden you can't come into the house of the Lord anymore to be with Christians? And they're shut in their little retirement village. Friends, listen to me. And all these stories, what we have to remember is that we're the family, right? We adopt, we visit, we care for, we provide. These are our family members, Paul says. So even right now, look around you. These are your sisters and your brothers and your fathers and your mothers, and some of us are crazy uncles. Every family has one. But the point that Paul's making is that it's even deeper than your skin and your blood. This is your family. This is your family. So care for them accordingly. Show compassion to them accordingly. Because you're going to spend eternity with them. And it begins now. It begins now.